It is my hope today that finally knowing who is responsible for Jane's brutal murder.
It had been a case that had gone cold for nearly a half a century, but through new DNA testing, the decades-old mystery has now been solved in the death of 23-year-old Jane Britton.
It was determined that Miss Britton had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. For the past 50 years, the murder of Jane Britton has intrigued members of the public and has posed a number of investigatory challenges. I am today confident that we are able to say that the mystery of who killed Jane Britton has finally been solved.
I was surprised. Very few people at the time thought it was somebody random who came in and killed her. Everyone thought it was connected to the anthropology department. That's Don Mitchell. In January 1969, he lived next door to a young woman named Jane Britton, and he was one of the last people to see her alive. For the next 50 years, he carried a theory about who killed her. Almost everyone who knew Jane carried some version of that same theory. Friends, colleagues, an entire department at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, all of them looking inward at each other for half a century. They were all wrong. A warning to our viewers. What you are about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Welcome to Crime View Central, where cold cases don't stay cold. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. If you're new here, hit like and subscribe. That's what keeps us digging into cases like this one. Now back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, January 1969. Jane Britton was 23 years old. She had grown up in Needham, Massachusetts, the daughter of a Radcliffe College vice president and a medieval history scholar. Education wasn't just encouraged in the Britton household. It was the family's language, the thing that shaped how they talked to each other and what they expected from each other. Jane had absorbed it completely, and more than absorbed it, she had excelled. She graduated magna cum laude from Radcliffe in 1967 and went straight into Harvard's graduate program in anthropology, one of the most demanding doctoral tracks the university offered, the kind of program that chewed people up and spat out only the most determined. Jane wasn't just surviving it, she was thriving in it. She served as a teaching assistant, the kind of role reserved for students the faculty trusted. That past summer, she had traveled to Iran and worked on an archaeological dig at a site called Tepe Yahya, helping uncover the remains of a Neolithic community thousands of years old, getting her hands dirty in the literal dust of human history. She had a reputation for quick wit, for being the kind of person who made a room sharper just by being in it, the kind of person other people wanted to be around. She lived in a fourth-floor apartment at 6 University Road in Cambridge, in a building owned by Harvard that was, by most descriptions, dilapidated and poorly secured, the kind of building where a graduate student could afford to live on a stipend, and where the locks were more theoretical than functional, where a fire escape connected one apartment to the next, like an afterthought nobody had ever bothered to seal off. On the evening of January 6th, 1969, Jane spent the night the way a lot of grad students spend the night before a major exam, trying not to think about it too much. The next morning was her general exams, the gauntlet that stood between her and beginning her doctoral thesis, the kind of test that could define the next several years of a person's life, depending on how it went. She had dinner with her boyfriend, a fellow anthropology student named James Humphreys, and a group of classmates. Afterward, they went ice skating on Cambridge Common. It was January in New England, cold enough that the ice held, the kind of activity that's as much about being together as it is about the skating itself. They returned to Jane's apartment around 10:30 p.m. James stayed about an hour. Jane talked about being nervous for the exam, the ordinary pre-test anxiety of someone who cared deeply about doing well. When James left around 11:30 p.m., she seemed focused, a little anxious, but ready. Nothing about that conversation suggested anything was wrong. It was the kind of good night that happens between two people who expect to see each other again the next day, at the exam, like normal. A few minutes after James left, Jane walked next door to the apartment of her neighbors, Dawn and Jill Mitchell. The Mitchells, like Jane, were connected to Harvard's anthropology department, Dawn Mitchell among them, all of them part of the same small, insular academic world. The three women shared a quick glass of sherry together, the kind of small, Easy ritual that happens between people who live next to each other and like each other's company. A nightcap before a big day, nothing more. At around 12:30 a.m., Jane said goodnight and went back to her apartment to sleep before her exam. No one saw her alive again. The next morning, January 7, 1969, anthropology graduate students gathered at Harvard's Peabody Museum to take their general exams. Jane wasn't there. It wasn't like her to miss something this important. Not after everything she'd worked toward. Not on the day it actually mattered. James Humphreys called her apartment. No answer. He sat through his own exam with that small worry sitting in the back of his mind. The kind of worry that's easy to dismiss until it isn't. James finished his exam and then walked to her building. He knocked on her door. Nothing. He went next door and asked Jill Mitchell to look with him. Inside the apartment, almost nothing seemed disturbed. Money was untouched. Jewelry was untouched. Jane's cat and her pet turtle were fine, going about their small lives as if nothing had happened around them. The apartment looked the way it always looked. Lived in, a little cluttered, the ordinary mess of someone in the middle of a busy life. Books and papers, and the small accumulated evidence of a person who was always working on something. Except for the bed, under a sheepskin rug and a fur coat that had been pulled up over her head, they found Jane. She had been struck multiple times in the head with something sharp-edged or pointed. One blow had fractured her skull. She had been sexually assaulted. The blood was confined almost entirely to the bed, as if whatever happened quickly, and happened to someone who never really had the chance to fight back or get away. Someone who had gone to sleep in her own home expecting to wake up for an exam and never did. No weapon was ever found. Police arrived within minutes. And almost immediately, the case took on a strange, theatrical quality that would follow it for the next 50 years. A quality that would shape not just the investigation, but the way an entire community understood itself. Scattered across the apartment, on the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and on Jane's own body was a fine red powder. Investigators identified it as red ochre, an iron-rich pigment that has been used by humans for tens of thousands of years, including in ancient burial rituals found at archaeological sites around the world. The kind of detail that sounds like it belongs in a novel, rather than a police report. For a department full of archaeologists, the implication was obvious and irresistible. Someone, a university professor among them, suggested the powder was consistent with an ancient Persian burial rite. Jane was an anthropology student. She had just returned from a dig in Iran. The story wrote itself almost too neatly. A ritual killing performed by someone steeped in exactly the kind of ancient practices Jane herself had. Spent the summer studying. Someone who knew what the powder meant and used it deliberately. The Cambridge police chief, faced with a press corps running wild with primitive rights theories, eventually instituted a news blackout over what he called inaccuracies in the reporting. But the story had already taken hold, and a blackout couldn't undo what had already been printed and repeated and absorbed. For decades, it would shape how people thought about Jane's murder, who they suspected, and how they suspected them, turning a murder investigation into something closer to an anthropological mystery about Jane's own field. There was something else missing from the apartment, too. A sharp stone tool. An archaeological souvenir that Jane had received as a gift from the Mitchells. The kind of object that, in the hands of someone trained to use it, could match the wounds on Jane's skull, almost exactly. A prehistoric weapon missing in the apartment of a murdered archaeologist, covered in a pigment associated with ancient burial rites. It was the kind of coincidence that practically demanded a story to explain it. Investigators had a building full of anthropologists, a ritualistic-looking crime scene, and a missing prehistoric tool that could double as a weapon. Of course, they looked at the anthropology department. Everyone did. For years, decades even, that was the shape the case took in people's minds, even when the official investigation had moved on or stalled out entirely. This case took 50 years to crack. This channel takes weeks for each story. Real records, real families. If Jane's story is getting to you, hit like and subscribe. That's how Crime View Central keeps going and keeps cases like this from going cold. Stay with us. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been near Jane that night and in the weeks before. James Humphreys, her boyfriend, who had walked her home and left an hour before she died, who would have to live the rest of his life knowing he was among the last people to see her. alive, and that some people would always wonder about that. Don and Jill Mitchell, her neighbors, who had shared a drink with her less than an hour before she went back to her own apartment for the last time, who had been so close, physically, to whatever happened that night. A man Jane had previously dated, a fellow student some called the Peru hippie, a nickname that tells you something about how small and gossip-driven this world really was. Even, eventually, Jane's own academic advisor, Professor C.C. Lamberg-Karlovsky, became a person of suspicion, the rumors so persistent and so corrosive that he was asked years later, in an interview with the New York Times, to address them directly. When a reporter asked him about it, his response was almost bewildered. There had been complaints, he said, about too much tuna fish at department gatherings. Hardly a compelling motive for cold-blooded murder, and yet that was the level of scrutiny an entire department had been living under. A neighbor told police they'd heard someone on the fire escape that connected to Jane's apartment that night. A detail that, at the time, got folded into theories about someone from inside the building, someone with access, someone who belonged there. A second witness reported seeing a tall man running down the street near the building in the early hours of January 7th, another detail that could fit almost anyone and so, in practice, fit no one. None of it went anywhere. The missing stone tool turned up again not long after the first newspaper reports, found exactly where it had apparently been all along, never missing in any meaningful sense, just misplaced in the chaos of a crime scene and an investigation. The red ochre, the detail that had launched 1,000 theories about ancient rites and anthropologists who knew too much, was eventually traced to something almost embarrassingly mundane. Jane was a painter, and ochre is a common pigment used in oil paint. It had likely been in her apartment the whole time, sitting in a jar or a tube among her art supplies, and was scattered across the room during the struggle on her bed. The primitive rites story collapsed under its own weight, but by then it had already done its work. It had pointed investigators, the press, and an entire community of Jane's friends and colleagues toward each other, toward Harvard, toward the anthropology department, toward anyone who might have known enough about ancient burial customs into something like this. The story was more compelling than the truth, and for 50 years the story won. What investigators did have, even in 1969, was forensic evidence from the sexual assault, traces of semen left behind by whoever killed Jane. But 1969 had no way to turn that evidence into a name. DNA profiling didn't exist yet, wouldn't exist for almost 2 more decades. The sample was collected and preserved anyway, the way evidence sometimes is, on the chance that someday science would have an answer the present couldn't give. Sealed away and waiting for a future nobody investigating the case in 1969 could have imagined. One was ever arrested. The case went cold, but it never really went away. Within the close-knit world of Harvard's anthropology department, Jane's murder became something more than an unsolved case. According to one account, female graduate students in the department for years afterward kept a kind of unofficial file on the murder, passed down from one class to the next like an inheritance nobody wanted, treated as a cautionary tale about the dangers facing women in academia. Jane's death wasn't just a tragedy that happened to someone else, a long time ago, to someone they'd never met. It was a story people carried with them, an exaggerated, horror movie version of something that felt, to the women who came after her, uncomfortably familiar, a warning passed down through generations of students who walked the same halls Jane had walked. And underneath all of it, for 50 years, was a specific and quietly devastating fact. A group of people, friends, neighbors, colleagues of Jane's, lived for half a century under a cloud of suspicion. People who had known her, who had shared a drink with her hours before she died, who had nothing to do with what happened, but who carried the weight of other people's theories about them for the rest of their lives, who showed up to reunions and department functions for decades knowing that somewhere, someone might still be wondering about them. Don Mitchell was one of them. For 50 years, he believed the killer was someone Jane knew from Harvard. Almost everyone did. It was the only story that made sense, given everything they thought they knew. Every case on this channel is weeks of digging, real records, real documents, real lives. If this story is landing, take a second and hit like and subscribe. It keeps us going, and now, back to the evidence that had been waiting since 1969. Decades passed. Jane's case sat in the Middlesex County files, one of the oldest unsolved homicides in the county's history, a file that detectives inherited the way detectives inherit cases like this, passed from one generation to the next along with everything that came with it. Forensic science moved forward in leaps, DNA profiling, then DNA databases, then genetic genealogy, and each leap meant cold case units could go back to old evidence and ask new questions of it, questions the original investigators never had the tools to even formulate. By October 2017, the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab had, for the first time, obtained a male-specific DNA profile from the samples preserved since 1969. Almost 49 years after the murder, a sample that had been sitting in storage since before some of the investigators working the case had even been born finally produced something usable. It was the first real movement the case had seen in decades. Investigators began the slow work of trying to match that profile. Genetic genealogy traces unknown DNA not by finding the person directly, but by finding their relatives, people who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to ancestry databases for entirely unrelated reasons, hoping to learn about their family history, never imagining their genetic information might one day be used to solve a murder that happened before they were born. The profile led investigators to a man's brother. Through that connection, the genetic profile was confirmed closely enough to identify the man whose DNA had been left at the scene in 1969. His name was Michael Sumter. Sumter had died in 2001 of cancer while serving a prison sentence for a 1975 rape. At the time of Jane's murder, he would have been in his early 20s, living in the Boston area. And here is the detail that cut through 50 years of theories about anthropology departments and ancient rituals and people Jane had known and trusted. Michael Sumter had no known connection to Jane Britton at all. He wasn't a classmate. He wasn't a colleague. He wasn't someone from the department, someone who'd attended the same dinners, someone whose name had ever crossed paths with hers in any record anyone could find, in any guest list, any class roster. Anything. He was, in the words used to describe him, a career criminal, a man already linked through DNA to other unsolved rapes and murders of women in the Boston area in the years after Jane's death, a 24-year-old woman named Ellen Rutchick in 1972, and a different woman, Mary Lee McLean, in 1973, both killed in their own apartments in ways that echoed what had happened to Jane, the same kind of crime, repeated by the same man for years. He had escaped from a work release program in 1985 and was connected to yet another assault during that time, a pattern stretching across more than a decade and multiple women, none of whom, as far as anyone could determine, had ever met him before the night he came for them. The pattern, once investigators could finally see it laid out across decades, wasn't the pattern anyone had spent 50 years looking for. It wasn't a colleague with a grudge, or a lover with a secret, or a fellow archaeologist enacting some twisted version of the rituals he studied. It was a stranger, a man who, as far as anyone could determine, climbed the fire escape that connected to Jane's building on the night of January 6, 1969, entered her apartment, and left less than an hour after her boyfriend had walked out the door, in the narrow window of time between Jane saying goodnight to her neighbors and the world finding her the next afternoon. The neighbor who heard someone on the fire escape that night had heard exactly what they thought they heard. In November 2018, just months before the 50th anniversary of Jane's death, Middlesex County District Attorney Marion Ryan announced the findings publicly. It was, officials said, the oldest cold case Middlesex prosecutors had ever solved, a fact that, after everything, almost seemed beside the point. This case posed many challenges for investigators, Ryan said at the press conference. Over the years, we followed up on many leads regarding individuals with suspected ties to Jane Britton. This case had several red herrings, including the presence of red ochre at the crime scene, which ultimately were unrelated to the crime. Over time, as people's memories faded and witnesses died, it became even more difficult to follow up on new investigatory leads. There are a group of individuals, Ryan said, who for over 50 years have lived under some cloud of suspicion, because there were some who may have believed they were responsible for Jane's murder. Don Mitchell, told about the findings, was direct about it. I was surprised, he said. Very few people at the time thought it was somebody random who came in and killed her. Everyone thought it was connected to the anthropology department. Most of Jane's immediate family had died long before the case was solved, Her parents never learning what had happened to their daughter, carrying that absence of an answer with them to their own graves. But her brother, the Reverend Boyd R. Britton, by then a vicar at an Anglican church in Santa Barbara, California, was still alive. He thanked the friends, journalists and investigators, including State Police Sergeant Peter Senott, who had kept the case alive across 5 decades, who hadn't let it become just another name in a drawer. A half-century of mystery and speculation has clouded the brutal crime that shattered Jane's promising young life in our family, he wrote. 50 years. 50 years of an entire community looking inward, suspecting each other, carrying a cloud that settled over neighbors and colleagues, and a professor whose worst offense, as far as anyone could ever determine, was hosting gatherings with too much tuna fish. 50 years of a story about ancient rituals and academic rivalries that turned out to be built on a pigment Jane had used in her own paintings, and a missing tool that had never really been missing in the first place. The man who climbed that fire escape didn't know Jane Britton. He had no reason to be in that building, no connection to her department, no place in any of the theories that consumed her friends and family for half a century. He was simply there, on a night when her boyfriend had just left, when the building's locks were more theoretical than real, and when a 23-year-old woman who had spent the evening ice skating and worrying about an exam went to sleep for the last time, never imagining that the danger wasn't inside her world at all, but had simply found its way in from outside it. If this case stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell us what you make of it. 50 years of looking for someone she knew, and the answer was someone she never met at all. Hit like and subscribe if you want more cases like this one. Crime View Central. We'll see you in the next one.